Let's return to the pyramids of Montauk, shall we? The investigation gets underway. I set out to find out what was at the bottom of the Montauk property enigma and sought out the index to the New York Times. Unfortunately, the Long Island paper Newsday is not indexed, and that makes research very difficult. Now, we discussed that previously. However, this is where we discover the pyramids. All right? So after Preston and Duncan were found innocent in the Montauk trial, I was just about to finish the manuscript for Montauk Revisited. Before I called the book complete, I wanted to go to the library and check the definition of the word Montauk. And for you, the viewer, that's spelled M-O-N-T-A-U-K. One more time. I was hoping to dig very deeply into the meaning of the word and pull a rabbit out of a hat. The surprise and intrigue at what I found resulted in me staying in the library for the entire afternoon. The most accepted definition for Montauk, again that's spelled M-O-N-T-A-U-K, came from Dr. J.H. Trumbull, an eminent Algonquin. The Montauk Indians were considered Algonquin Indians. Algonquin, that's spelled A-L-G-O-N-Q-U-I-N, Algonquin. So the word Montauk is associated with Algonquin Indians. Now, the student who suggests the word is from Montauk, a name frequently bestowed on high or hill land, denoting a place for seeing or to be seen far off, or a place of observation. Although this was the most accepted meaning for the word, no one was going to dispute that there was no absolute certainty about the word. From the perspective of the Montauk legend, a place of observation is most appropriate if you consider looking through windows of time. But the real intrigue and surprise I referred to above is not so much the definition of Montauk, but the information I discovered while doing the research. Going to the reference section on Long Island, I first noticed a thick book. The author's name was Wilson. I immediately picked it up, titled Historic Long Island by Rufus Rockwell Wilson. The book had no index, and the table of contents was not much help either. I did find a list of plates, though, and therein was listed the pyramids, Montauk. I opened to page 317 and found a picture of a pyramid-shaped mound that appeared to be about 25 feet from top to bottom. There is a man standing near the base. In the distance, if one looks closely on the original plate, one can see two other such mounds. Oddly, I could find no other mention of the pyramids or Montauk in the entire book. The book was published in 1911, so we know the photograph was taken sometime previously. I had never heard about these pyramids or mounds. I will later elaborate on them, but we'll first continue with the process of discovery as I researched in the library. Pyramids, Montauk. The photograph below, which I'll include in the video thumbnail, is a reproduction of the photo from the book Historic Long Island. It is possible that the pyramids were originally larger than they appear. By the time they were photographed, dirt and sand could have created a buildup to fill the large spaces between them. The next thing I found was that the dialect of the Montauk Indians was lost. One account said that George Pharoah was the last one to speak the dialect. He was the sachem, or chief, of the Montauks, and spoke his native language to John Lyon Gardner in 1798. It was stated that the name Pharoah, spelled exactly like the Egyptian type, had a long and important place in Montauk history. The Pharoah family were related to Chief Winandach, known as the greatest of the chiefs, and their name appears in many land documents concerning property disputes. Montauk had been coveted by the white man since his arrival on Long Island. There was also a very famous pharaoh from the Montauks, and his name was Stephen Talkhouse Pharoah. He was descended from George Pharoah and spoke an ancient language in addition to English. P.T. Barnum even hired him for a time and billed Stephen as King of the Montauks. Interestingly, during his childhood, he was bound out as a farmhand to a Colonel William Parsons. Parsons was considered notorious by some and was accused of enslaving the Montauk Indians. Unfortunately, I have not been able to find out any further information about him. Next, we have to consider a vital question. What does all of this mean? Suddenly, the pyramids of Montauk pop up in my research. Next, it's pharaohs. This connotes a logical association with Egypt, as I mentioned earlier. Stephen Pharoah and the Montauk Indians being enslaved to a man named Parsons is also highly ironic when one considers Jack Parsons and the stories relayed about him in Montauk Revisited. As you will recall, Jack Parsons is considered the father of modern day rocket science. He was also a devotee of Aleister Crowley, along with L. Ron Hubbard. That's Jack Parsons. Obviously, there was more synchronicity related to Montauk than could be logically denied. At this point, I was just beginning to see the tip of the iceberg. As I continued to study in the library, I next encountered Thomas Jefferson, the same one who served as president. You may know him or remember him. He was at one time very interested in the native tongue of the Montauk Indians and wanted to preserve the dying language. In fact, the matter was so important to him that he traveled all the way to Long Island in hopes of retrieving it. Jefferson reported that there was only 3 old Indian women who could speak the language. He dutifully recorded the vocabulary, alphabet, and even composed some sort of dictionary. It was not an exhaustive work, but was said to be a rather complete job considering the entire situation. I was intrigued as to why Jefferson would go to such outlandish bother to record the language. It occurred to me that he was a Freemason, and there could have been some underlying motive that would not necessarily be spoken of. I then read that he claimed to have lost the bulk of the Montauk language in the Potomac. Only a small part was not ruined. If it was so important for him to travel all the way to Long Island in the first place, why didn't he make a return trip? I soon took my questions to Kenn Arthur, my friend who seems to know far more than he should, especially about Montauk. He was mentioned in Montauk Revisited as being highly critical of Preston's stories, but also telling me that the real story about Montauk is far more bizarre than Preston could ever imagine. First, I told him about the pyramid. "You're finally getting close to the truth about Montauk," he said. I then told him about Thomas Jefferson and his pursuit of the Montauks language. He told me that the tongue the Montauks spoke was known as Vril, an ancient Atlantean tongue. Vril, V-R-I-L. It's also the name of the same Kundalini, life force, prana, chi, ki, Vril, V-R-I-L. But this tongue the Montauk spoke was known as Vril, V-R-I-L, an ancient Atlantean tongue. Kenn said it was a later version of an even more ancient tongue called Enochian, the language of the angels. Vril, as I stated, is more commonly known as a form of psychic energy or force. According to Madame Blavatsky, the Atlanteans called it MASH-MAK. This is a rough phonetic approximation to the word Montauk. The earliest reference to Vril that I know of at this time is in Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, which was eventually used as Nazi propaganda. While Enochian is known to have its own grammar and syntax, it is a hidden language, and you will likely have a hard time finding out anything about it. Vril is supposed to have derived from Enochian, yet is even more obscure. "How do you know they spoke Vril?" I asked Kenn. "I just know," he replied. My next question was about the name Pharaoh. Why did the Montauk Indians have a chief's name Pharoah? And why was the name so prominent in their history? Kenn told me that there have been only 2 civilizations in the history of the planet Earth that used the name Pharaoh. Egypt, of course, was one. That came easy. "What's the other?" I asked. "You should know that," he answered. Atlantis? I asked, knowing I'd hit the mark. You got it. Now it all began to make sense, and I stressed the word began. There is much more to this entire scenario. I asked him if he could tell me anything further about the pyramids. Kenn said that there was at one time a series of small pyramids out at Montauk. They were supposedly white and appeared to be made of brick-like objects. He said they were covered up or perhaps even taken underground, but he was not sure if the pyramid mounds I had discovered in the book were the same one. In Montauk Revisited, I mentioned my friend John. His father was once in charge of the Montauk Lighthouse on behalf of the Coast Guard in the 1940s. I asked him if he had ever heard about the pyramids. He said that his teacher once took the class on a field trip in 1943 and showed them all a field where Indian mounds had once stood. As the photograph in this book was taken prior to 1911, it would seem that the pyramid mounds were raised sometime between the two dates. The military, probably around World War I, has already been fingered by some as the culprit, but we don't know. In fact, I have been completely unable to find anyone who even knows exactly where the pyramid mound stood. My next phone call was to Madame X. She is a lady referred to in Montauk's Revisited, who says that the mystery schools have been monitoring Montauk as a planetary energy point for some time. I told her about the pyramids, and she said that she was not surprised. In fact, it made perfect sense. Why? I asked. Don't you see? She replied. I wasn't sure what she was getting at and asked her to clarify. Where else do you know that there are pyramids? She asked me. Mars, I replied. Exactly. I recalled a conversation with her 6 months earlier when she talked about the relationship between Mars and Montauk. She wouldn't elaborate on it too much at the time. I would have to discover it on my own. Now, Madame X was telling me that Atlantis, Mars, and Montauk were intimately related. She also threw Egypt into the alchemical soup. She was trying to feed me. What she was basically saying was that all of these locations, including other sacred sites that house pyramids and other geometrical structures, are part of a grid system. This idea is not new, and I had already heard many versions, but none I had encountered were easy to understand in terms of function. Consequently, I began to study this area from a functional point of view. For those who are not already familiar with the idea of a grid, perhaps the easiest way to grasp this is through the mythological correspondence of Atlas, the Greek Titan, who supported the earth on his shoulders. Atlas was the son of Uranus, god of space and or the heavens, and was the brother of Kronos, god of time. It is more than ironic that a book of maps is referred to as an atlas. The stories of him actually carrying the earth were a metaphor for the idea that our planet is supported in space and time by a series of grid lines. The grid is actually a network of three-dimensional geometric shapes that act as a skeletal structure of the planet and could be viewed as the bones that prop up or hold up matter. How about the third-dimensional digital matrix, the frequency fence, the frequency barrier? According to Greek mythology, Atlas was the father of the Pleiades, also known as the Seven Sisters, which figure in the creation legends of almost all primitive tribes. For example, many Native Americans believe that they descended from the Pleiades. All this is important because it implies that Atlas was senior to the stars, and the geometric grid system that supports the Earth would therefore extend out to the solar system, the galaxy, and throughout all of space and time. And interestingly, the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters, the kind of the vaguely pyramid or question mark looking figure that the stars, that the Pleiades Seven Sisters depict or show as, are right above where I live. This little side note, little interesting side note. One can envision the grid as a pattern for creation that some stellar or divine influence used in order to create a planet or the like. Such a grand creation would have to be balanced off at certain points and would eventually become a very complex ecosystem, even prior to biological life being added to the equation. It is called morphogenetic grid because it is constantly rotating in different directions and ever changing. Morph means change, and genetic refers to the fact that it generates our universe as we know it. To try and chart this enormous clockwork of existence is an extreme challenge. The Mayans were one of the most successful. Unfortunately, most of the work that is available on this subject is not terribly clear and leaves one clamoring for more meaning. As the Earth rotates around the sun, the grid lines of the Earth move at different rate, but they are all ultimately tied to the same system. From a human standpoint, we can attempt to understand the system by at least two methods. The first is through mathematics, which would include a complete breakdown of the intricacies of the grid that is beyond the scope of this present work. The second method would be through correspondence and sympathy, which would clearly embrace synchronicity. This second method would also include simple mathematical correspondences, but would not go so far as to try to explain every last manifestation, which the first method would be obligated to do. We will examine this subject a bit deeper later on in this presentation. The fact that pyramids once existed at Montauk demonstrates that the location was recognized as a key point on the grid. This in itself suggests a correspondence with the pyramids of Egypt and Mars. There are also legends of a pyramid underneath the Atlantic where the sunken continent now rests. Not legend, it's been confirmed that the Bimini point, at that point, there's actual, it's all been photographed. And plus there's pyramids up in Antarctica that are about to be released. All that information is about disclosure. So pyramids everywhere, all over this planet. There are also legends of pyramid underneath the Atlantic where the sunken continent now rests. The very name Atlantis is derived from Atlas, presumably because the ancient Atlanteans used the energy grid of the Earth to power their various vehicles. The Edgar Cayce materials discuss this and also how the Atlantean culture settled in Egypt. In essence, all that is Egypt is believed to have derived from Atlantis. Edgar Cayce, if you're not familiar with that, folks, he's the Christian mystic. Look him up. His work is brilliant. God rest in peace, Mr. Cayce. The legendary connection between Montauk and Atlantis can be observed in the geology of eastern Long Island. Originally known as an island throughout most of its history, Montauk is only connected to Long Island by a slender sandbar that has been fortified in recent years. Traditionally, one was said to be on Montauk when one traveled there or off Montauk when one left. Additionally, the geology of Montauk is different from that of Long Island proper. It is very much like an extended mountain that reaches above the sea. Some say it is a remnant of ancient Atlantis that didn't sink, and that the Montauk Indians derived from the ancient Atlanteans. The royal family name of Pharoah is very suggestive of this particular theory. Long Island is believed by most geologists to have found its current place from ancient glaciers pushing down from the North Pole. Whether or not Montauk was part of this movement is debatable. If so, its connection to the North region links it to the ancient Aryan myth of Hyperborea and its capital city of Thule. The Nazis were fascinated with Hyperborea and its relationship with Atlantis. As there has always been a strong German connection to Montauk, this is just one more correspondence. We have now established at the very least that the language and legends of the earth betray a strong association between Egypt, Atlantis, and Montauk. Our next point to consider is Mars. Obviously, pyramids exist there, but I was surprised when Madame X called one evening soon after our initial discussion about the Montauk pyramids. She told me that after our talk, she had picked up a book entitled Cairo, Biography of a City by James Aldridge. Of more interest to her was that one of the contributing authors was D.A. Cameron, one of the most knowledgeable Egyptologists of his day, circa 1890s. This book explained, amongst many other things, that Cairo, whose real name is Al-Qahira, means Mars. According to one account, the city of Cairo was originally to be called Mansuria. A large continent of slaves surrounded the perimeter of what would become the city. They all stood by with digging equipment, waiting for a bell to ring, which would signal the time to begin building. Astrologers stood by as they had chosen the exact time to start the project. To everyone's surprise, a raven, the symbol of occult knowledge in the Native American tradition, rang the bell. The astrologers felt great fear and decided to name the city Al-Qahira after the planet Mars, which was ascending on the horizon at the time. They had a great fear of Mars because, according to legend, that was the planet from which people came down and conquered their land, setting up pyramids and the Sphinx. The name Cairo is only one clear connection between Mars and Egypt. Madame X told me that I could find numerous correspondences if I looked hard enough. Consequently, I began a somewhat exhaustive study to find more correspondences between Egypt, Mars, Atlantis, and Montauk. I searched through various books and soon came to the Temple of Montu in Egypt. Cairo, where the Great Pyramid rests, is 100 degrees from Montauk. If you break the earth down into dodecahedron, a polyhedron with 12 plane faces, there is a direct correspondence here in terms of pure geometry. As a further matter of interest, Montauk is on the same parallel as Olympus in Greece and the mythological city of Troy in present-day Turkey. Mythological Troy is north of Cairo and was supposed to be in its glory at the time Atlantis finished sinking. Montu, also known as Monthuré, was the god of war in Egypt, and a temple was built for him in Karnak. The god of war is an exact correspondence with Mars, the Roman god of war. Montu also corresponds to Montauk as a phoneme. A further example of linguistic correspondence is noticed when we consider that Montu was known as Mintu or Minthu by the Romans. This relates phonetically with Min-an-Tol, the ancient circular stone in Cornwall that Amado Crowley remembers from a ceremony on August 12, 1943. Later in this presentation, we will examine different aspects of the Earth grid and the various locales mentioned in this chapter. What is important to realize at this point is that my investigation of the word Montauk has resulted in my stumbling into the crossroads of some very interesting connection. There was a much bigger picture at work than either Preston or myself had realized when the Montauk project was written. The descendants of the Pharoah family were obviously a major mystery and an important piece of the puzzle. I continued my search in the library, trying to find out how they acquired that particular name. I discovered that white settlers often gave native glorious names like king in an attempt to placate them, but this was not what happened in the case of the Montauks. There was no record of the Sachem Winandanch being crowned as a pharaoh from the settlers, and he apparently didn't use the name himself. The name would later appear in deeds, and its exact history, until further notice, is lost in antiquity. What was clear in Montauk history was that there were several land disputes that concerned the Pharaoh family. To my surprise, there was mention of the land that included what would eventually be known as Camp Hero. It turns out that the Montauk Air Force Station was constructed on sacred Native American ground. This put a whole new twist to the entire situation, but there was only one problem. A New York State Supreme Court decision at the turn of the century had declared the Montauk Indians extinct. I would consequently look deeper into this case and discover a real live human drama that only deepens the mysteries of Montauk. There are refreshments in the cafeteria. It's now intermission time. We will continue later our journey to the pyramids of Montauk. Namaste, namaskaram.